Thank you so much, and it's really great to be here with you today. I really love the Broadband Institute and the Progress Summit. In fact, I think this is my 5th summit. Rick kind of accused me of being like a deadhead for the Broadband Summit, hanging around to get the t-shirts. And, you know, I've just always enjoyed the way this brings together the social democratic movement, the progressive movement from across the province. It's such a recharge. And as I was flying out from Regina yesterday, I realized this is my first time here in this role. And somehow it sunk in a little bit that my role had changed. I have Tommy Douglas's old job. How cool is that? Yeah. And I don't even want to think about the size of shoes those are to fill, but it's really encouraging to think about how we here, all of us are standing on the shoulders of giants, in our case, prairie giants, carrying on the tradition of the Saskatchewan CCF NDP, a CCF NDP that has always punched above its weight. And I'm proud to be a New Democrat. I'm proud to be a New Democrat from Saskatchewan. Is there anybody else here from Saskatchewan? All right. You know, that's an oversized representation. This is good. Thank you to all my fellow Saskies who I'm sure, like me, are proud and humbled to be part of carrying on the legacy, the New Democratic tradition, the social democratic tradition of Tommy Douglas. And what did Tommy Douglas tell us? He told us to dream no little dreams. Dream no little dreams. And that's a phrase that's always stuck with me because that, to me, is the beauty of our movement. It's why I'm so proud to serve in this role, because we dream big, but it doesn't end with dreams. We're not lying on the side of a hill looking at the clouds, hoping that things will get better. No, we dream, and then with drive and determination, we do the work to get the job done. We dream, and we deliver. Saskatchewan, you know, we're a small province, a little over 1 million people, but by virtue of being a small place, sometimes we can try big things. Sometimes we can do big things. If you look at the history of our party, we looked around Saskatchewan and we saw that people didn't have electricity and that life in rural Saskatchewan was harder as a result. We saw that people were losing their homes and even their lives because they couldn't afford access to health care. We saw a province that was buried in a mountain of debt, bordering on bankruptcy. And what did we do when we faced these enormous challenges? We didn't throw up our hands and say, no, it's too hard, there's nothing we can do. No, we refused to accept that, and we got to work. We saw a problem, and we found a solution. We saw darkness and did the work to bring light with rural electrification. We saw sickness and did the work to bring healing with the introduction of Medicare. We saw a province weakened, broken by debt from an irresponsible government, and we did the work to return it to strength. These are not small things. It took a lot of years, it took hard work and sacrifice, but it worked. Our dreams became a reality. And isn't that what Progress Summit is about? About coming together, sharing our challenges, sharing our dreams, and sharing our knowledge of how to get the work done, how to make our dreams a reality. Because here's the thing about dreaming. You don't get to stop. There's always more work to do. And in Saskatchewan right now, we have work to do. We have a premier who refuses to distance himself from the Yellow Vest movement as he flirts with far-right populism, sending a discouraging message to newcomers and encouraging those who would spread hate against them. And we have a province that has done nothing meaningful on reconciliation, and that is one dream, a dream that has been carried by First Nations and Métis people for generations, a dream kept alive by Cookums and Mushums, but not yet delivered, a dream of equality, a dream of reconciliation, a dream of the treaty relationship as it was meant to be. In Saskatchewan, as in many places in this country, that dream has too often been ignored, pushed aside, or downright trampled. And the results are clear. In our province, Métis and First Nations people are unfairly overrepresented in illness, in unemployment, in incarceration, and in violence for too many years. and for too many people, what should have been a dream of peaceful coexistence has instead been a nightmare of residential schools, of the 60s scoop, of poverty, of intergenerational trauma and structural violence. But Saskatchewan, again, it's a small place, but we can do big things. I fully believe that can change, and I believe the moment is happening where people are waking up, recognizing the need to change, recognizing the opportunity that Saskatchewan can show leadership. Leadership in reconciliation. We can be the place that gets it right. Working with the kind of people that you're about to hear from today. Because if there's any dream worth dreaming, any dream big enough for all of our drive and all of our determination, it's the dream of healing what has been so grievously harmed, of moving beyond nice words to achieve real reconciliation. And if we're able to make that dream a reality, well, it won't be because people like me come up with the exact right plan. No. It will be because we listen to women like those we're about to meet. Dreamers, storytellers, leaders. I'm so honored and proud to be with you today on the traditional unceded territory of Algonquin Anishinaabe people and be able to introduce the speakers who are about to join us. We have Tanya Talaga, who's Anishinaabe from Fort William First Nation. She's an award-winning journalist and author of 7 Fallen Feathers, and she recently toured the country with her inspiring Massey lecture series, All Our Relations, Finding the Path Forward. If you haven't heard Ms. Talaga speak before, brace yourself. In the stories she tells, in the stories she's uncovered, she holds a mirror up to some dark truths of our country. And she also shines a light on the possibility of healing and growing from what we learn from those truths. After her talk, she'll be joined for a panel discussion by Jessica Wood, Sityaawks. Her name means woman, get that exactly right, woman who creates change. What a beautiful name. And I think that would apply to all 3 of the women we're about to see here, women who create change. Her particular role, she has an incredible role in the public service with the NDP government in British Columbia, working to implement the recommendations of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And the Truth and Reconciliation recommendations and relevant case law, weaving a new and lasting approach to relationships between the province and BC First Nations. She's from the Gitxsan, Tsimshian, Tahltan, and Nisga'a nations. And we'll also be joined by Nahanni Fontaine. Nahanni is status Ojibwe from the Saskatchewan Anishinaabe First Nation in Manitoba. She's the NDP MLA for St. John's. She's their House Leader and the critic for justice and spokesperson for status of women and missing Indigenous women and girls. And if you're like me, yeah, we can clap for Nahanni and her great roles anytime. And if you're like me and you frequent the Progress Summit, I'm sure you too will never forget her presentation from a couple of years ago and the incredible power of her storytelling and her inspiring leadership. Listening backstage to their conversation in preparation for the panel you're about to see, I was so inspired and so keen to learn from them. We're fortunate to hear their stories, their thoughts, their dreams, and I ask you to commit to working with them to deliver, to make those dreams a reality. Please welcome Tanya. Thank you.
Buzu, Ani, Tanya Talaga, Nigisnikas. I'm always really happy to be here on unceded Algonquin territory. I always feel welcome here. And I would like to say thank you very much, too, for having me here today. And that was such a beautiful, beautiful opening from Ryan, too. You know, he's... He makes it look so easy to come up here and stand in front of hundreds of people and just smile and give a wonderful speech. I mean, like, you know, I have to say I'm admire someone like him. And he's a doctor, and he's a leader, political leader too. Well, I'm going to be talking today about a number of things, because today I was asked to speak about, or the title of this talk was supposed to be, making reconciliation real, current best practices and next steps. So I often sort of, when I get a request like that, and I usually get this title like this, I always think to myself, oh, how am I going to respond to that? Well, I think this is how I'm going to respond to it. And this is what you're going to listen to for the next 20 minutes. I'm going to respond to it by saying something kind of controversial, and it was a sentence that I started my very first column at the Toronto Star with in January. The Toronto Star is my home, and somebody thought it was a good idea to make me a columnist. And thank you very much for that opportunity. And the very first column I did, I started with this sentence: reconciliation is now officially over. And when that went out, I think maybe it stunned a lot of people. Maybe it stunned a lot of people if you are non-Indigenous. But if you're an Indigenous person in this country, you probably weren't too shocked with that statement. Because to be fair, reconciliation has always been kind of like a slow, meandering, broken down engine, limping along the track, led by politicians who never really quite know where this train is going. Many Indigenous leaders don't use the word reconciliation because it really isn't plausible when First People are still fighting for basic human rights in this country, for water, for land, for social services, for health care, and for education. I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again. Sometimes I think that the reality of 2019 looks a lot like Canada's colonial past. We see evidence of this time and time again playing out in many separate but related fronts. And I'm going to just outline a few of them for us here today. I'm going to start with a 12-year fight that's been undertaken by an incredible woman who I know, and I know that you all know in this room, and that's Cindy Blackstock. Cindy is a Gitxsan social worker. She's executive director of the First Nations Family and Caring Society, and for 12 years, she has been fighting the federal government to end a long-standing and well-documented racial discrimination against First Nations kids. And actually, she was in court yesterday here in Ottawa in a tribunal room doing the exact same thing. She was, once again, asking the government to comply with Jordan's Principle, a principle that was passed unanimously in Parliament in Canada in 2007. And that principle basically says that all Indigenous children should be treated equally, have the same social services, healthcare services, education services as all non-Indigenous kids. And this time, Cindy was going further too. She was making sure the government was also taking care of children who are caught in non-status situations. And there are a lot of kids that are in that area and that need our help. And why are they in that area? Well, because of a law that we've had on our books since 1876, the Indian Act, a paternalistic piece of legislation that has historically governed every aspect of Indigenous life in Canada. Through it, as you know, Canada established Indian residential schools, and to this day, the Act dictates who can receive treaty rights and who cannot. Blackstock in 2018 said that the definition of the First Nations child in this country needs to be broadened. We need a better definition. First Nations children without status who live off reserve but are recognized as members of their nation should not be excluded, she argued. It should be up to the nations, not Ottawa, to determine who is a member of the community. She told me why her fight was so important. She said, you know, children in life-threatening situations shouldn't be left holding the bag. I don't want this to be a fight about blood quantum. This is about the rights of children. Now, the Canadian government did give $1.2 billion for Jordan's Principle in the last budget, paid out over the next 3 years. But yet, Cindy spent all day yesterday in a tribunal courtroom fighting. She said, "Our job is to make sure they spend the money to treat all the children with equity. The government has the money. They have to stop prioritizing other matters over our children." You know, when Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was first elected, he began his term by pledging his undying love and his commitment for Indigenous people, saying that his #1 priority was to make the relationship work. Now, it is not an act of love or reconciliation to send in militarized police to arrest 14 First Nations people in northern BC defending their own land against a pipeline. Yep. In January, heavily armed members of the RCMP climbed over wooden sticks and handcuffed these land defenders. The hereditary chiefs and their supporters are trying to safeguard the land, here's the thing, for all of Canada's children, Indigenous or not, from a proposed natural gas pipeline on their territory. This is all part of the same fight, to be fairly, legally recognized in a country that spins stories about the sincerity of reconciliation and the importance of nation-to-nation agreements, not to mention adhering to international law. As Ottawa continues to fall short of upholding Indigenous rights, the emptinesses of promises of reconciliation are laid bare for all to see. I'm going to point a little bit now to the Indigenous Languages Act. You know, when First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were sent to residential schools, they were forbidden to speak in their own tongue, and if they did, it was essentially beaten out of them. As a result, generations of families lost their ability to communicate with their past and with their culture. This was also lost when the children were taken away from their families during the 60s scoop. The United Nations says that there are 87 Indigenous languages that are in danger in vanishing in this country over the next 100 years. But what will the Indigenous Languages Act that was just unveiled, how will that help? Will it help anyone retain their dying language? I'm going to say no. The bill lacks teeth, and it does little else other than to create an Office of a Commissioner of Indigenous Languages to advance the use and reclamation of our vanishing languages. The creation of a commissioner is hardly a panacea or even really a help. According to Inuit, Tapirit Kanatami, and Nathan Obed, who represents 65,000 Inuit, it will be a, quote, powerless advocacy body perpetually burdened by costly and onerous reporting duties. Not to mention, it'll be controlled by the federal government. Unlike the Official Languages Act, the bill contains no federal obligation to fund language use or any reliable financial support. The legislation says, after consultations with diverse Indigenous governments, bodies, and organizations, the Minister of Canadian Heritage will then suggest short and long-term funding patterns. But what? Asked Dr. Judith Sayers, president of the Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council. What does that mean? Does it mean you're diverse if you're from the north, the south, or the west? Or does it mean you're diverse if you're First Nations, Métis, or Inuit? The legislation should be changed so consent is obtained from all First Nations and Indigenous groups before funding is decided. And concerning the Commissioner and the officer's 5 directors, again, the minister only has to consult with a diverse group, whatever that means, in order to promote people, recommend them to cabinet, who should serve these 5-year terms. That doesn't look anything like self-determination to me. It looks like a long arm of colonialism, once again, trying to decide what is best for Indigenous people. You know, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, it was signed by 143 countries in 2007. It is not clearly reflected at all in this bill. And I should tell you, too, that there were 4 countries that held out in signing UNDRIP for quite a long period of time: the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and of course, Canada. They did not initially sign UNDRIP. That took years and years in this country of really hard work to get to where we are now, and the bill is moving through the Senate. And that work was done, as you know, by NDP MP Romeo Saganash. But my point about UNDRIP is if this language bill was in compliance with UNDRIP, we would have an Indigenous officer, and directors appointed by Indigenous people, accountable to Indigenous people. And speaking about UNDRIP, I'm going to turn my lens a little bit now to something that happened yesterday. Well, it happened yesterday for me because yesterday I was getting off of a plane. I was coming in from the University of Minnesota, and of course I went onto my Twitter feed to see the latest news. And I found out about what was going on with the Prime Minister at the Laurier Club and the fundraising effort that happened there. Yes. So, I remember I was telling you I filed this column for this Toronto Star. Well, I had one column actually going and working. I was doing something actually on UNDRIP, but on a different angle. But then all of a sudden I'm like, I can't do this. I called my editor up and said, I've got to do a different column. I have to do a column on what was said about Grassy Narrows. And then I picked up the phone. And I called the chief of Grassy Narrows, Chief Rudy Turtle. And I was lucky. I got him. And it's actually a kind of a classic story on how I got him too. I was calling for somebody else. And it was funny. I was calling for somebody else. And actually she's like, oh, this isn't the number. This is my sister's number. Call this number. So I called that number. And that number happened to be at the band council office. And the woman who answered the phone, she goes, yeah, my sister, she's not here. And so I told her why I'm calling and I asked if she was well. And then she said to me, you know what you should do? You should talk to the chief, and he's walking right by me. Totally classic. So I said, okay, hand him the phone. So she did. So I said to Chief Turtle, I said, did you hear about what went on in Toronto? And did you hear the Prime Minister's apology for what he said? And he told me he did. He said, you know what? I heard it, I acknowledge it, but I do not accept it. Just a recap on what that was about, why the PM was apologizing. It was because of an incident, like I said, at the Laurier Club. A demonstrator appeared as the Prime Minister was speaking, and the demonstrator unfurled a banner in an attempt to draw the PM's attention to Grassy Narrows. And Trudeau responded by saying, thank you for being here, Trudeau said, his voice rising over the commotion because security staff at this point started to try and bring her out. Thank you very much for your donation here tonight. I really appreciate it. And the members of the Laurier Club, who, like the demonstrators, had paid $1,500 per plate to be in attendance, laughed. The people of Grassy Narrows did not laugh. And the same could be said for the people of White Dog First Nation, also poisoned by mercury. They were made sick by 10 tons of mercury dropped into the Wabigoon and English River system between 1962 and 1970 by a company that really just didn't give a damn. For decades, they have demanded, the people have demanded that the governments of Ontario and Canada help them to clean the water up, to restore their health, their way of life, and their sacred held land. But the Crown, too, didn't give a damn. Even with all the recent apologies and pledges to act, movement to help the people has been so slow. Chief Turtle told me, I've heard it all before so many times. It's all words, words, words. He said to me, you know, there's still no specialists in our community who can treat mercury poisoning. If we want to get treated, we have to hop in the car and we have to drive an hour away and go see our family doctor. Even not specialists dealing with mercury poisoning, just their family doctor. People are still fishing in the water and eating contaminated fish. He said to me, you know, where would we go? People say we should move. But this is our land. This is where we're from. This is where we live. He said to me, you know, a health center was promised here in 2017, but that still has not materialized. The community wanted to break ground on this health center this summer, he said. And he said he's done the feasibility study, he's done all the work that they asked, so he doesn't really understand what the holdup is. Trudeau's glib laughter represents an attitude that has no doubt costlier manifestations than the Prime Minister's cheap joke. As Turtle said to me, even an insult hurts. And it's quite amazing that an insult can still hurt on centuries of scar tissue. You know, Turtle also said to me that he always hears Trudeau talking about how he wants to fix things, long-standing issues with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. He has heard him say that the most important relationship Trudeau has is with Canada. But he no longer believes the Prime Minister when he says that. Turtle said to me, again, it's all just words, words, words. So I'm going to finish with something that Senator Murray Sinclair said to me. I'm going to tell you something that he told me. When he was, as you know, chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in this country, he worked so hard, and he told me that when he was working, in the back of his mind, the one thing he kept thinking about why he's doing this work, because he wanted to empower a cadre of people with the knowledge of the stories of the 6,500 survivors, the witnesses to what had happened in this country since the mid-1800s to 1996. He wanted Canada to know what had happened. From the start, he told me his purpose in doing the TRC was to, quote, arm the reasonable. But Senator Sinclair did not stop there. He also told me that the changes needed for reconciliation will not come about merely because governments and churches and institutions will stop doing what they are doing. No. He told me they will come about because Indigenous people will begin to do what we have to do for ourselves. He said, we as Indigenous peoples have been led to believe in our own inadequacies because we have so many that have arisen from our history of oppression and abuse. They virtually dominate our existence. When we are able to rise above them, we still are unable to see that the solutions that work best for us are those that have sustained us for thousands of years. What was he really saying? What is his message to all Indigenous people? It's this. It's look inward. And when it comes to arming the reasonable, that is where you come in at this summit. All of you. You are the reasonable. You guys have just had 2 days of meetings and seminars about nation building, about listening, about being inclusive, about being a fairer, stronger country to all the people who live here, no matter the color of their skin. So this is my challenge to you. You have the tools. You are, in a sense, armed. How will you all make a difference? And with that, little challenge. Miigwech. Miigwech, now I think I have to stop talking. And I'm going to invite the others. They're supposed to come out now.
Buzu, MSA.
Thank you for joining us. And we have to say, just so you're all on the same page as us, this is totally unscripted. We don't even really have questions. We started talking in the back in the green room, and it was really hilarious, actually. We were supposed to have questions because we were all supposed to coordinate our calendars at one point and try and figure that out. But sadly, all of us were kind of everywhere, and it didn't really happen until you reached out on Facebook one late night, and because, as you know, we all use Facebook Messenger to keep in contact with each other. And you're like, what are we going to say? And I was like, well, I don't know. This is going to be good. But you mentioned this should be a discussion about what it's like to be sitting around the kitchen table, having some tea, having some bannock, and talking about what our thoughts are. And, I wanted, since I'm sort of a person who always makes questions up for a living, that's what I do, I thought that maybe I would start by asking a question. And I wanted to actually start by asking a question to you, Nahanni. I wanted to, and then I'm going to ask you the same question. I wanted to ask you a question of, is there room for us in contemporary politics? And I know that's a hard question, considering who I'm sitting here on the stage with, both of you. But is there?
Anine, everyone. So I am Nahanni Fontaine. I'm the NDP MLA for St. John's. That was previously noted by Ryan, which I say miigwech. I just say miigwech to Broadbent for inviting us on the stage today, which I think is proper to have 3 Indigenous women on the stage to talk about reconciliation. In answering the question in respect of whether or not there's room for Indigenous peoples within the political sphere, let me just share this, and it is wholly my perspective. In the Manitoba legislature, in the last 124 years, there has been somewhere like 834 men elected and 60 women. Predominantly everybody, that space was made by and for white men. So of the 834 men that have been elected, predominantly all of them have been white. Of the 60 women who have been elected, only 5 are not white. And I know that sometimes my language makes people uncomfortable when I start saying, when I talk about white people, but I think that it's important for us to recognize that. And so of the 5 for the 5 women who are not white, the first non-white woman to ever be elected is my colleague, Flora Marcelino, who is a Filipino. The other 4 are Indigenous. There's myself, my sister Bernadette Smith, who is an NDP MLA. The first ever First Nation woman elected to the Manitoba legislature is my colleague, Amanda Lathleen, who is the MLA for the PAW. And then we have a Liberal sister, who is Judy Clausen from Kiwetinog. Is there space? I would argue that it's taken us this long, particularly as Indigenous women, to claim that space. The first ever Indigenous woman was only elected in 2015, and since then we have 4 now in total. I don't know if it's about, this narrative like, well, we have to make space. Actually, it's about reclaiming that space and making that space ours. Which I will just share as well very, very quickly, that it's not easy. I can tell, I'm very open and honest about everything, but the first 6 weeks that I was elected, I was actually in a shock. Because you walk in that space, you sit in that chamber where very, very few people ever get the opportunity to do that. And I can tell you unequivocally, it is a toxic male space. And it is difficult to sit there and to fight for your space and fight for your people. But now is the time to do it if there was ever a time.
Miigwech. Jessica?
So I'm here as a public servant. So
I
any
know.
political affiliation I may have is not represented by my presence here today. And yet I am a political body simply by being an Indigenous woman. What I say, I agree very much with reclaiming the space. I come from Smoigit people. I come from noble, high-ranking people with a long tradition, not just of singing and dancing, but of governance, of economy, of healthcare, of science. And we have all of the traditions that make for a great community. And to bring that teaching is a teaching of public service, which is what I think elected and public servants are. We are public servants. I strongly believe that these are our spaces, and somewhere along the line, we were made to feel unwelcome in our own decisions. I am often the first or the only Indigenous person, let alone queer Indigenous woman in a space. I work in a resource ministry, so my colleagues are largely from the resource sector, and they do not look like me. So when I walk into a space, I physically represent the change that I am actually ushering in. And it's not because I'm... Don't clap for that. It's uncomfortable. I appreciate the honor, but it is unbearably uncomfortable so much of my time. And yet, I should be entitled to this space. The fact that I have discomfort is not because I don't belong there. It's because I shouldn't be alone there, because my interests are there. So regardless of how much space there is, it is ours. If it's not on this land, whose land is it on? If it's not our governance, whose governance is it? So I firmly believe that we are entitled to all of this space, that we are entitled to our own decisions, that we can lead not only our nations, but the nation.
Miigwech. You are both such powerful women. You have both had, before you got into bureaucracy and politics, you did so much for so many. And it's tiring work, right? It's such hard work sticking up and defending our women, all the work you both have done. And I wanted to ask you both, and this is part of the kitchen table part, how do you keep going? How, sometimes aren't you tired? And how do you do it? How do you just keep going?
I think that is a really important discussion to have among what I hope are allies. Because I would suggest that probably some of my Black brothers and sisters in the room will understand what we're talking about when we say we're exhausted. We're exhausted of educating and re-educating. I'm exhausted that every time, like my sister, every time you're the only Indigenous person or the only Indigenous woman in a room, and you have to fight for what little dignity will be given to you, or what little humanity will be given to you. I'm exhausted of trying to make people understand and know and experience the goodness of our people, the genuineness of our people, the resilience of our people, the happiness of our people, the love and the courage of our people. I'm exhausted. I've been doing this work for close to 22 years now. And on the front lines, in the protests, at funerals, you name it, I've been there. And I have always said that it is my sacred responsibility to do so because I have the strength and the privilege and the ability to do so. But it is important for people to stand up so that I don't have to do it anymore, so that my sister doesn't have to do it anymore, so that my sister over here doesn't have to do it anymore. You know, when we talk about reconciliation, and it was ended with, what are you going to do? You know, stand up, educate yourself. When you see racism, when you see a lack of representation, stand up. It is your responsibility. That is what an ally does. And if you want to practice reconciliation, that is one way to start, is to stand up, educate yourself, and take away some of the emotional labor that we're forced to do 24/7. And I don't say that in a I'm so angry and there's another, angry Indigenous woman. It's that I'm exhausted. Just yesterday, one of our youth wrote on her Facebook, she said, I'm exhausted. She said, I'm exhausted of working in white space, trying to educate white frontline workers about the traumas that our people have been through. And like us, I'm exhausted of being negatively socially constructed because I'm forced to do so. We're exhausted as Indigenous people. So you can help by that one thing. That is a manifestation of reconciliation, is stand up for us.
Rich.
I'm tired. I'm not going to lie, but I have the privilege of being tired for a very different reason. I work in a government that put implementation of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People into every single mandate letter, who has pledged to bring the declaration. I don't use the acronym because I find it undignified, and I think that we should refer to our human rights in a dignified manner. But my job is to bring that declaration into provincial law by the end of this year. So, yeah, clap for that one. I'm tired because we were able to secure a $3 billion investment directly into the hands of Indigenous people through our sharing gaming revenue. That's $100 million a year directly controlled by Indigenous people into the hands of Indigenous people. I'm tired because we're doing housing as a province on reserve for the first time in Canadian history. So I am tired, but I'm not defeated, and that is the difference. But one of the things you talk about is that activism and that activism at funerals. And the reason that I'm tired is because I'm alone. I am alone, and I am in this position, and I have this title, and nobody understands by the acronym what it is that I do, so then I explain it. And it's so impressive, but I didn't write the declaration. I wish I had. I knew a few people that did. It was written by Indigenous people. This is Indigenous knowledge and wisdom. I'm tired because I've been passed a baton that has been carried for so long that we don't even know who picked it up in the first place. And I'm tired because I shouldn't be here. I am not the fastest, I am not the smartest, I am not the most educated. I am the one who survived from the women who protected me when I could not keep myself safe. I am not here because I am exceptional. I am here because the circumstances of my survival allowed for it, not by design, but by accident. So many of the women that I love and respect have been lost along the way. So many women from my community, we have the highway of tears. From my community, we have the downtown east side. From my community, we have immeasurable numbers of loss, so I do not have the privilege of not being tired, but I also have the privilege of being here. So the reason that I take up that space is because the thing that they left me with was hope. The thing that they left me with was allyship. The thing that they left me with was the ability to dramatically change where we are today so tomorrow is nothing like it. And I am tired because I want to fundamentally shift the direction that we have been on since contact.
Do you mind if I just follow up with that? And I want to follow up and say miigwech for that. And why I think, when I started by saying it's proper to have 3 Indigenous women, because in the context of the Canadian colonial history that we have and the continuum of said, we presently, this very minute, operate and live within a country in which Indigenous women and girls are slaughtered on the daily or are stolen on the daily. So for the 3 of us to be on this stage alive, to be able to come before you and talk about reconciliation or the importance of political representation or any of these things, in and of itself is bloody phenomenal. My mother, my sister here talks about the Vancouver downtown east side. My mother left the reserve, I shared this, last year at 13, was sexually exploited across Canada, lost her life from a heroin overdose after living 14 years on the downtown east side. And like my beautiful sister here, I know that I'm only here because of my ancestors who came before me. So the very fact that the 3 of us are here alive is phenomenal. And I just want to, acknowledge each and every one of the Indigenous women across the country who survived today in a very spiritual, emotional, but certainly a very physical way.
Gitchin miigwech for acknowledging that. I have to say it's the same thing. We are standing here, sitting here with our ancestors. Our ancestors got us here. They survived it all so we could be here doing what we're doing here today. And it's so true. I'm glad you brought up what we were talking about too in the back before we got on stage, which was none of us really wanted to be sitting up here doing this right now. We didn't have a burning desire to be up there doing what we're doing. What are we doing? We don't know what we're doing, but we're doing it because we looked around and it's like, well, you've got the baton. And it's true. We don't know where it came from, but somebody passed it to us and we happen to be standing in the right spot. And so there is that feeling of responsibility. You know the stories. You've been given the stories. Now you have to carry them forward, which is what I think that all of us try to do. In keeping with that, what does, and you touched on this a little bit about all the incredible work you are doing to make sure human rights are respected in BC. But what, for you, Nahanni, what does progress look like? How do you know we're getting anywhere?
I mean, that's such a multi-layered question. Let me just start with a little bit of a political backdrop in Manitoba, excuse me. In 2016, the NDP government, when we were still in government, passed the Path to Reconciliation Act, and it legislated the ability and the need to look at reconciliation in a comprehensive, robust manner, similar to BC. We lost government. We currently have a PC government under Brian Pallister. I can tell you what it doesn't look like right now. So we have a premier who, I think it was last year, there was discussion in respect of night hunting, which our people would or do consider as a treaty right. And actually he was caught, filmed, or whatever, audio taped, speaking, unlike our Prime Minister, just a couple of days ago, speaking to a group. And actually what he did in there was he talked about how, we have, and again, I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the whole thing, but essentially he said, we have a whole bunch of Indigenous men, criminals, who are night hunting. So in that one sentence, what you did as the premier of a province was you constructed all Indigenous men and boys as criminals, as if we don't already deal with that 24/7. When our young men and our young boys cannot walk down the street without being carted or cannot walk down the street without being stopped. But here you have the premier who fundamentally situated Indigenous men and boys like that. I'm raising 2 Indigenous boys, strong, powerful, smart, handsome Indigenous boys. As an Indigenous woman, I was so offended. And remarkably so, which I thought was offensive, was that there wasn't much outrage about that. And that gives you just a brief glimpse into how Indigenous people are seen. And so, I share that story with you because I think that it is particularly egregious in 2018, 2019 to have a premier who very consciously negatively socially constructs Indigenous men, Indigenous youth. But what is changing? What is the change that gives me hope, and I suspect most of us across the country, are our youth. I'm sure that you can go anywhere across the country and see Indigenous youth who are so bloody powerful and so engaged and so articulate and standing in their truth and standing in their power as Indigenous people. When I see that, I think of the work that we've done and the work that's come before us. That is the fruit of all of that work. For my sons to be so proud of who they are and to walk with such pride and strength, that is the fruit of all of that hard labor.
Very well said.
The piece about youth and what we get to do, I talked about the things that we as a province are doing, but it's dangerous to take for granted. It's dangerous to think that somehow we initiated any of those ideas. That's being responsive. So I still have to have the talk with my children about where they put their hands if they're ever pulled over in a vehicle. I still have to talk to my daughter about her safety in a way that nobody should ever have to articulate, and she knows too well because she has watched me for 20 years participate in that conversation. She knows too well why, as a second-year university student in sciences, she has no contemporaries in her school. And those things are not okay. And those things are the exception and should be the rule. There is no reason why my JA, who is 86, mostly blind, partially deaf, is still able to run an Airbnb and a catering company, be up before me and go to bed after me and run our whole family and administer justice and not be recognized for the economic powerhouse she is in our community, for the way that she has been able to raise us to be alive, to have dreams, to articulate them. My auntie was the first one in our family to go through university. As an adult with kids, we don't expect our children to be in university straight out of high school, so there weren't services there to support her when she enters into the culture shock. And we can change that. That's policy. But that's also kids in care. That's also the hope, right? That's why we do it. I have this conversation of how to keep yourself safe against ridiculous circumstances. I have to articulate and I can't articulate even to them what's happened to me. I can't articulate the absolute impossible. How could I share that? How do you share that? But no, you try to share the resilience. You try to share the strength. We're trying to put back in place that inheritance from our ancestors that is life, not death.
Such powerful words. And I know we all know this so intimately too, what you're saying. I want to say, since we are here, I'm going to turn this for a minute. And if we were sitting around the table, I would also be asking you, why should we vote in the next election? And what are we looking for? Who's the best? No, I know where I'm sitting, and who I'm talking to, but put all that aside. If you could have your wish, what would you see? What would you want?
I'm not Jody. No, I'm kidding. I get that a lot. I'm not.
That was funny. No one wants to take this one. Oh, she's going to do it. Okay, good.
Well, I think that's a great question. And you know what? I really do appreciate the folks that just yelled out Jody. I think that we have seen in the last month, there is no better, no quintessential example of the strength and dignity and courage of Indigenous women than what we saw last month in Jody Wilson-Raybould. And obviously, even though we are in different parties, I have, as an Indigenous woman, I have an enormous amount of respect and love for what she did, and not only for what she did, within the confines and the bubble of what is, party politics, but what she did for all of Canadians. I think it is important to recognize what goes on in those levels. And so I have an enormous amount of respect, and we all should. Why should people vote? To me, I have been voting since I was 18. I have raised both of my boys to come to every single election with me from the time that they were babies. My oldest now is 23. He's been voting since he was 18. And why I think it is so important, even in the midst of frustration, is that people lose their lives across the world to be able to vote. It is a right, but in many places it's an absolute privilege. People lose their lives to go cast their vote. We are so blessed to be able to stand in line and cast our vote for those that align with our values and our morals. We have an opportunity. So here's two things. Sorry, I know I'm going all over the place. We have an opportunity to do two things. One, in every election, municipal or provincial or federal, it is incumbent on political parties, but also the voters and also labor to back and support people of color, Indigenous candidates, Muslim candidates, Sikh candidates, everybody. Because if you look at our legislatures across the country, it does not reflect our provinces, and it certainly does not reflect our country. There has to be space made to ensure that our legislatures reflect the population. That only makes our legislatures better, more representative. It is incumbent on all of us to pursue those goals. I know that for myself in Manitoba, do you know that it is 2019, and I know maybe some of you guys have heard me say this, but we have never had a Black person elected to the Manitoba legislature. We've never had a Muslim person elected to the Manitoba legislature. I don't know what the stats are across the country, but that is unacceptable. It is simply unacceptable. Voters deserve better. We all deserve better. So my second point, and I'll stop, is that we have an opportunity this election to create history across Canada by electing the first person of color prime minister in Jagmeet Singh. And that is a responsibility that if you are on the left, if you are progressive, then to get out and make that happen.
This is where I take my public service hat off. I'm going to put it right there. It's got my business card and my title. I can't tell you who to vote for. I can tell you that what has happened in BC, the potential that we have to live up to fundamentally change what comes next as Indigenous people has been centered in the work of the entire province of 30,000 public servants. So I'm tired, but 30,000 public servants are pretty tired right now too. So it's work. And to intrinsically commit to that work, to do the big things, is something that I hope people will consider when they vote. And I hope you will push to have voting boxes on reserve. I hope you will push for the Indigenous youth vote. I hope you will make this central to your platforms, not now, but forever, because the work isn't going to stop. Somebody asked me once, well, so how long do we do this? They asked me. And I've been Indigenous my whole life. When do we stop? Now. We stop that ridiculousness, that oppression now, and we vote. And we vote in the people who will actually represent us. We vote for the people who will have the integrity to stand behind the human rights of Indigenous people. We vote for the people who will ensure that that is intrinsic in our laws and our practice, and that it is not window dressing. We vote for the people who will take our interests and our human rights and our lives into consideration and prioritize that, our water, our land, our conversations. Public service hat back on. Okay, thank you.
I think we're down to the last couple of minutes before we have to vacate this space. And
Can we ask you a question?
No, I was trying to deflect this entire time. It just, okay, fine.
I have heard you speak. Now, I've had the honor of hearing you speak as you traveled through the Massey lectures, and how you held that space, not for yourself, but for the stories that you were carrying. How do we hold that space for you further?
Miigwech, that's a beautiful question. Thank you. We share the space. We hold the space for others. The space is not mine. The space comes from the past. As we know, as Indigenous people, we think of the past, those who came before us. We think of those who come after us. We think in circles. We think that everybody belongs. Everybody has a role to play. Every life is sacred, and we are all part of the continuum. I wanted to bring that message with me when I went to visit, and I hope that I bring that message every time that I write and every time that I speak, that we all matter and we all can change things. And it sounds simple, but it is, and it's not, but we can do it if we work together, if we be the change. And I'm always, you said this earlier, I'm always thankful for our youth, because they're the ones that are actually showing the way forward. We're getting older now, and that baton, that mystery baton that we were talking about that somehow landed in our laps, it's going again to someone else. And the generation that's coming up, they have so much, and they have their own burdens. They carry with them the traumas our families have been with, but I hope we're getting to a spot where they're working through it and they're getting over it, They're going to use the strength of resiliency and hope that we have in our communities to be part of the continuum and to keep going. And I think we're done. I think that's it, isn't it? Yep. Yeah. All right.
Hi. Where's everybody going? I'm just joking. I have the great, don't pay attention to them. I have the great honor and privilege of introducing my brother, Jagmeet Singh. So, if you know anything about me, you know that I bloody love women. I love women, I love girls, I'm a staunch, unapologetic feminist. For me, everything is about women, da-da-da. So, but I'm super excited about Jagmeet. And I was thinking to myself, why do I love Jagmeet so much? Like, I absolutely loved him. I was